welcome to another Europe is Possible discussion about what changes after the EU elections. My name is Julie Ward. I'm on the National Committee for Another Europe is Possible, and I was a Labour member of the European Parliament from 2014 to 2020. This has been quite a worrying, anxious time for all of us. The polls weren't looking very good. There's lots of analysts out there trying to understand what it might mean for the EU, but also for us and for other third countries. And we've got some great speakers this evening. The meeting, I think, is being recorded and also being transcribed. Okay. I'd ask you, if you don't mind, to stay muted until the part where we have a bit more interaction with questions and answers. If you're comfortable about asking your own question, that's fine, but you can put it in the chat and we'll monitor that also. Okay. So without any further ado, I want to welcome the very first speaker. So Alice Picard, who sits on the board of ATTAC France, has agreed to join us very briefly. She's got to be at another event. This is a really crucial moment for organising in France, but we think it's very important to have someone from France to give us a snapshot of the current plans on the left and the prospect ahead of their snap election. So as Alice speaks, you might want to put any questions in the chat. We'll try and follow up as much as we can. Okay, so Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm very sorry I can't stay, but we have our board meeting. We're meeting every week these days because the political situation is changing very quickly, as you may know. I have made a presentation. I hope I can share my screen. Yeah, it seems to work. And I'm very sorry, it's been a while since I last discussed all these topics in English, so I'll do my best. So I still wanted to mention a few things about the European elections. So that's how the seats were divided in 2019 and in 2014. So as you can see, France has contributed a lot to the collapse of the Green and the centrist liberal parties and to the expansion of the far right. That's one of the highlights of this election. The good news is the radical left's results are stable and even slightly better than in 2019. Sorry. The result of left-wing parties the situation is the result of the left-wing parties campaigning separately and having each their own list. And the Social Democrats came third after the far right, the National Rally, and Renew, the center right. So that's the results list by list. In France, and I'm aware it's not the same in every country, you have a 5% threshold. You get a seat only if you get to that threshold. So you have the Green, the two parties from the far right, because you have the National Rally, but also Reconquête, which is even more extreme than the National Rally. And there was Renew, the Social Democrat, the left, the France Insoumise, les Républicains, which are the conservatives. I wanted to give you a few elements from political sociology because there were a few surprises for this. I mean, the results, the polls, it was not, the result in itself was not a surprise, but in terms of the turnout, it was. There was half the population or half potential voters abstained, and it really benefited to the National Rally because its voters remained mobilized, unlike the Macronist or left-wing voters. And there were some surprises compared with traditional observations, like the turnout rates among people with the lowest levels of education were much better than at the last election, and sometimes even higher than among people with the highest levels of education, which is not what you expect from this kind of election. But this effect is neutralized if we zoom in on the turnout of each age group. So among very young people, still people with the highest level of education still voted more than people with the lowest level of education. What we can say that the radical left, so La France Insoumise, attracts a lot of young people's votes, and its score decreases with age, and it attracts a lot of votes among the less wealthy people. The problem is young people's electoral participation is said to be irregular. We can talk about occasional voters. They're more critical of the representative system, but they are no less interested in politics. They were really involved, or they are really involved in social movements, especially around climate, the feminist movement, or the queer movement. What we can say, and that was to be expected, among executives and managers, Glucksmann, so that the Social Democratic candidate, is on a par with Bardella, so the candidate of the National Rally. But the National Rally may have reached its glass ceiling, so this is why we can be quite optimistic about the upcoming election, because maybe there's not the remaining part of the population that the far right can tap into is not that great. And yeah, because as you can see, Bardella lost very few votes compared to Le Pen in the first round of the presidential election, which was 2 years ago, so we can have this comparison in mind. On the contrary, Manon Aubry, who was the leader of the France Insoumise list, lost 5.2 million votes compared to Jean-Luc Mélenchon in 2022. So that might be a map that you have seen. So it's what's the word? They're very brown, but I don't know what's the word to in English to talk about the far right, but it's everywhere, even in part of the country which were quite immune to the far right vote up until very recently. I myself am from Brittany, the tiny bit of territory in the west, and for a long time we thought the far right could not do very well. But it's brown everywhere except maybe in a few cities, and so that's why the decision by Macron to call early elections were the shock, because for me on Sunday night I thought, but what is he doing? The far right has made record results, and he's calling for elections, which means that the risk is that we will have a far-right government in less than a month, especially that this snap election was a request from Bardella, so the far-right candidate. It really looks like a gamble. the far right could win an absolute majority of the seats in the National Assembly. So the absolute majority is 290 seats and above. It's a very risky bet because, but however, as I said, the National Rally may have reached its glass ceiling. And Macron wants to decredibilize it. He thinks that if the far right comes to power, it will prove that it is unable to govern, but it's a very, very risky bet. Macron wanted to remobilize his voters. That might not work. He made that decision when the left appeared very divided. He wanted to split it even further. He said that the majority would not support a candidate against social democratic candidates. It didn't work. The Socialist Party joined the coalition you might have heard about, but I will talk about it in a minute. Macron wanted to establish himself as a bulwark against the far right. He made a falsely democratic gesture, a call to the people. He wanted to distract attention from the European elections because it was a very complete failure for his party. And there are three possible scenarios. Record high for the National Rally, but still a relative majority for Renaissance, so the current majority. But it will have to form a coalition government with the far right. There's a second scenario of cohabitation government. And then Macron would be in a presidential posture against, in opposition to the National Rally, or a left-wing victory and then a cohabitation government. And it was the case in 1997, as that would not be unprecedented. That's why the lefts made a marriage of convenience. They have created the New Popular Front. It's a historical reference to the Popular Front in 1936. Left parties created a coalition then against the far right, which was very high and powerful at the time during the 30s as well. The coalition comprises the Socialist Party, the France Insoumise, the radical left, the Greens, the Communists, and the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste, so the anti-capitalists. It was announced very quickly on Monday night after calls by social movement organizations to unity. There was a real movement calling for single left-wing candidates in its constituency. Many social movements, organizations, and trade unions have publicly expressed their support for the coalition and de facto called to vote for it. And that's unprecedented given the history of independence of trade unions vis-a-vis the political parties. There have been a few problems, and that's why we are meeting very regularly these days, because social movements and trade unions' place in this popular front is unclear. It's still it's a coalition of political parties. There were highly problematic nominations. For example, François Hollande, the former president, has been nominated, and Macron, and you have to remember that Macron was in government during his term. And there's a question how to prevent a victory of the National Rally and even push for a victory of the left without giving a blank check to parties whose policies will be fought against in the streets. We're not completely delusional. We know that the Socialist Party will not push for policies that we agree with. Given its history, and it's a very recent history. It was in power between 2012 and 2017, and we were in the street. For example, in 2016, there was a very big mobilization against a reform of the labor law, which which was a real attack against labor, against workers' rights. And just maybe you need these elements to really understand the situation. EU elections and legislative elections are very different systems. EU elections were proportional representation, while legislative elections are a two-round first past the post system. There will be 2 rounds, the first on June 30th and the second on July the 7th. There will be 577 separate races, each one race in each constituency, and in most cases only 2 candidates make the runoff. There's a 12.5 threshold rule, and it is very likely that pro-Macron voters will play as arbiters in most of the runoffs that will probably oppose the National Rally and the new Popular Front candidates. And that's it for me. If you have any question, thank you very much for your attention. And I hope it was clear.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. It was amazing, actually. Thank you for putting the visuals and the graphics together for us. I think that's really helpful. Could you just briefly explain a bit more about ATTAC? Because I don't think everybody here actually knows about your organization. I did put a link in the chat for people who can speak French, but if you could just briefly just give a little snapshot about ATTAC.
ATTAC was created at the end of the 1990s, when the altermondialist, so not anti, but the social movements which were really critical of globalization were very high at the time. It's a movement that was created when as organizations, trade unions, some media outlets came together to create this organization, which first struggle was to put in place taxation of financial transactions, but now it's broader than that. We say that we fight for tax justice, environmental justice, and social justice more generally. The movement we are closer to is Global Justice Now in the UK.
Okay, that's really helpful. I did put the link in. I hope people will look at it. There's 2 questions come up in the chat, Alice. One of them, David Blackman, would you like to ask your question? Yeah. If you unmute yourself, if you can.
Hello. In the end, France Insoumise joined with the rest of the left. Why was this not a natural thing? Now the whole of the left is in the Popular Front, but some groups like France Insoumise were hesitant. Is that true?
Yes, and we are not very happy ourselves because, as I said, the Social Democrats, so the Socialist Party, even though it is called socialist, has nothing to do. If you want to compare with your British system, I would say the Socialist Party is like the Labour Party. It was in government for during 5 years, 10 years ago, and it was very problematic. As I said, there was this labor law reform, which is very problematic because it's this whole narrative of I mean, I don't really know how to explain because it's still a very French way to phrase everything or frame everything, but it's
maybe I can help here, Alice. Basically, it wasn't radical, and that is
it was not radical at all.
It wasn't radical, and that's what people were crying out for. They were crying out for radical change. So, yeah, and that meant that Intermees, want to represent something that breaks much more with the old systems and has a more radical view. That's my understanding of it. But sorry, just to further develop that question from David Blackman, because the threat of the far right is so serious now, do you think there's any chance that there will be some rapprochement between those two groups in order to put a cordon sanitaire around the far right?
I don't know. It's, to be honest, I've changed my mind a few times already in a week. But I was looking at results from polls, and if you look at how voters are thinking, it's very strange, because you have 85% of people who voted for La France Insoumise, who are very clear that they're going to vote for the new Popular Front. Voters of the Greens and of the Socialist Party are more hesitant because they think La France Insoumise is too radical. So the threat to unity comes from the Socialists and the Green more than from the radical, which is quite ironic. We are very clear that the far right in government would be a very dangerous threat to social movements, and that's why we really don't like the Socialist Party. We fought against it, but we know there is more at stake, and that we really need the far right to stay out of power, because it would put in place policies that would destroy social movements, trade unions first, and every possibility to mobilize. It's a real threat against racialized people and every kind of minority groups. We are very clear about this, but some other people on the left think that somehow the radical left is another kind of threat.
Yeah. Okay, I understand that. It sounds like a very dynamic situation, and it sounds like we'll probably have to have you back again in a few weeks to find out what you think is happening. There are another couple of questions. Would you mind just answering those? We'll try and make it quite quick. James Newell, would you like to ask your question? Not a speech, but just a quick question, please.
Yeah,
James.
I'd like to ask you, when you say that the Rassemblement National may have reached its glass ceiling, what do you mean exactly? Can I just ask also, am I right in thinking that Jean-Luc Mélenchon is actually quite Eurosceptic and very much opposed to open borders, or is that not correct? Thank you.
Yes, it's to your second question. I don't know what he thinks in reality, but there has been this tendency in the left, just like in Germany, to think that if you want to take votes from the far right, that you need to kind of adopt its agenda. And so but I think we've come a long way now. A few years ago, I would have said, yes, it's very unclear about migration, but things have changed. And I think that La France Insoumise is a bit, I mean, its platform is clearer now. But there was this tendency, yes, to think, okay, we have, like, for example, working class. The working class is racist. We have to work with that. And so if we want to win votes from the working class, then we have to be racist ourselves. But there was a real change. Now La France Insoumise is seen as the only party. For example, the votes of Muslim people in France is 80% for La France Insoumise, because it's the only party whose stance on the struggle against Islamophobia was clear. So I think that's changed. But a few years ago, yeah, it wasn't clear. When I say that the National Rally may have reached its glass ceiling, I mean that although it has scored very well in very large portions of the population, it has not done better than 2 years ago. And of course 30% is huge, but it's a proportional election. And dynamics are really different for the legislative elections, because the system is just not the same. And as I said, maybe every voter, every potential National Rally voter turned out last Sunday, but it's not the case on the left. A lot of people stayed at home, didn't understand the stakes. So we have a lot of potential voters to tap into on the left, and that might not be the case for the far right.
Yeah, I can say it certainly was my experience standing for elections against the British National Party and various other far right groups here in the UK, that they tend to use democracy to undermine democracy, whereas the utopian left just get a bit kind of fed up and say, you know, we don't like everything you're offering, so we're not going to vote, in a kind of grumpy kind of way. There are 2 other questions. If people can be quick, would you be able to take them, Alice? Is that okay? Or do you need to go?
Yeah, I can do it
quickly. Very quick. Okay.
So...
Alan Yearsley, I saw that you had a question in the chat. If you could make it quite concise, I think Alice would be able to answer it. And then Barbara Siegel, and I'll close the questions there. So Alan, are you still with us?
Yes. So now, do you see France moving towards a 6th republic in the near future? And what reforms would you like to see from a 6th republic? Possibly proportional representation and more devolution of power to regions, departments, and communes?
Quickly, I don't see it happening anytime soon, because that's in the platform of La France Insoumise. But La France Insoumise is not in a very good position to negotiate with the Socialist Party, because the Socialist Party was the third force, the third party in this European election. And the Socialist Party was in government just a few years ago. It has no interest in changing the political regime the Fifth Republic is a very comfortable constitution when you're in power, and the Socialist Party was critical in the 60s and 70s at the beginning of the Fifth Republic, but as soon as it won a majority itself in the 80s, it was completely converted to the Fifth Republic. So unfortunately, I don't think that even if the left won this election, which is I want to be optimistic, but if I'm realistic, I will be happy if we, if we prevent the National Rally to have to win a majority. So the Sixth Republic, we might want as a social movement to push for it after July, but I think we're stuck with the Fifth Republic for a long time.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to call Barbara Siegel to ask her question briefly. Barbara?
Thanks, Julie, and Alice. It's been great to hear from you. I'm just wondering, in the first round, hopefully the left bloc will do fairly well. It's looking reasonably optimistic, but they certainly will come third in many constituencies, I think. If that's the case, will the supporters of that bloc, do you think, sort of hold their noses and support the Macron bloc as they did in the last election? Or do you think many will abstain, as you said they did in the Euros? Thanks.
I'd say that actually the reverse will be true. The Macron bloc will come third, and and as I say, I'm not sure that these voters will vote for us, for the Popular Front. Well, as I said, we are most of it. Well, I don't know. You're right. I'm not sure, because we are a bit fed up of this. We voted for Macron against Le Pen in 2017. We voted for Macron again 2 years ago against Le Pen. And my experience of discussions within the left is that not everyone is clear about the threat of the National Rally. Some think that if it was to seize power, then there would be a great mobilization of people, and I'm not so sure about it. I'm more optimistic now that I see the mobilization these days. A lot of people are organizing events, rallies, meetings, but so in a few words, the Macron voters will not give their vote to the new Popular Front, and I think the left will be divided between giving its vote to Macronist candidates, and the other half will abstain.
Okay, I think there's obviously going to be a bit of catching up to do, and things are going to be changing. Yeah. Sound very dynamic. Alice, thank you so much for your time. If you don't mind, I just wanted to ask a question about Kylian Mbappé, who is the captain of the French football team, and how significant is it that people who have incredible celebrity status, massive popular following, how significant is it that those people are now speaking out?
Yeah, as I said, it's really unprecedented. So I say that they are behaving just like trade unions. It's very uncommon for trade unions to publicly support political parties. And for a figure like him, it's quite unprecedented as well. I think that in the past, he's wanted to appear as apolitical. But that's what I said about young people. They are very divided between the left and the far right, and there's hope in that. Maybe sometimes older people might tend to think that young people are not very politicized because they don't vote or they don't turn out to every election. But I would say you could argue the contrary, that they're very interested in politics, just in a different kind of politics, and that might be. But I mean, I'm not. I've just heard about the news, so I would have to maybe more do. I would need to do more digging about. Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you go though. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your precious time at this really important moment. We really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to move on now to the next speaker. Thanks, Alice. Goodbye. Good luck. Solidarity. I'm going to move on to the next speaker, and sorry, I was a last minute chair, so I didn't kind of organize the speakers, but I think it would be very good to have a male voice now, if that's okay. So James Jackson, I hope that you're here.
I'm here.
Fantastic. Right, great. Hi, James. You're a Berlin-based journalist and maybe more familiar to our audiences regarding your uncompromising reporting on Germany's outrageous handling of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So we'd really like to hear your thoughts about how this political crisis interacts with the AfD results, which is quite a grim picture in Germany again. So, and also the collapse of the Greens there, and the Wagenknecht formation, which I think is the left doing some weird kind of blue Labour stuff, and also future policy in Germany and how that might impact on the European Parliament. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm afraid I didn't produce any spreadsheets or forms. I guess I should just quickly give a little brief overview, since we're talking in the wake of the European elections. There are, as you pointed out, quite a lot of topics to talk about in terms of German politics at the moment. I think the main thing which people picked up on was that the far-right AfD has been came in second place. It was, I think, that is definitely some of the news, but there has been a lot more news than that. I think they could have actually done a lot better. They came at, I think, 16%, whereas they were polling up to 24% at the start of the year. So I think that does show that, you know, they do have some pretty strong support, particularly in the territories that made up the former East. There's been a lot of maps where you can see Germany, who votes for who, number one in each constituency. But of course, and then you see that most of the West, or almost all of the West, is black, which is the color of the Christian Democrats, the Christian Union, and the right, the left is all blue, which is the color of the AfD. So it's not to be disputed that the AfD did very well. I think it's the best ever result in an election, and this is also, must be noted, directly in the wake of a number of really big scandals. So they had two scandals. Their two top candidates, as you probably know, the European list system works in that you nominate your top candidates, and depending how many votes you get as many candidates as you do going down the list. So, you know, your first top candidate is the one who's most likely to get it, and then if you get more votes, it's usually about 0.7%, 0.9% of the vote, and you'll get a candidate through an MEP. So the top two AfD candidates were both caught up in sort of spy scandals. So particularly the top candidate, Maximilian Krah, who styles himself as a bit of a German Andrew Tate. He tells left-wingers that, you know, he tells young men that they need to be right-wing to get a girlfriend, and he's very good at TikTok, it has to be said. You know, he really dominates there. But he was accused, alongside number two, Peter Bistron, who's actually Czech-born, of taking money from Russian oligarchs that were close to Putin, from a sort of spy network, not from a network, a propaganda network. And he was also independently accused, and I did a story about this, independently accused of employing a Chinese spy as his parliamentary assistant. And, you know, I think the evidence there is quite strong. although he does deny it, I have to say, on both counts. So the AfD really had quite a crap campaign in that sense. Their two top candidates, in fact, were banned from campaigning for the party, and now have been, Elise Krah has been removed from the AfD's group. They were also responsible for Le Pen chucking them out of the ID grouping, which is the furthest right grouping within the European Parliament. So actually, it could have been a lot better. But I think what it does show is that there is a sort of core support in the of the AfD, particularly in the East, but not entirely, and that will vote for the AfD no matter what, because even if they are accused of spying for Putin's Russia, quite credibly accused of having candidates who are, working with far-right Putinist propaganda networks, or even employing Russian Chinese spies. I think one crucial difference between France, Italy, and Germany with regards to the far right is that most other parties like Le Pen, like Meloni, have signaled their moderation as they've approached power. They've shown that they're not quite the old fascists they used to be. They've got with the times. They've put their demons to sleep a little bit. The AfD has been the exact opposite of that, actually, and I think that's one thing that's quite worrying about them. That you see, the more extreme they get, the more they signal that they have a complete disrespect for democracy in Germany, for the European Union, for the European project, and the West itself. Many of them are, of course, supporters of Russia and opposed, arms for Ukraine. I guess that's a bit of a hot topic in the UK left, but so I think we do really see quite a lot of things to be worried about. But as I said, 16%, that they were ahead of the Chancellor's party, the SPD. Historically, I think it's the oldest party in Europe. So that was quite humiliating for the SPD. They're all throwing around accusations. I think a lot of people are very unhappy with Scholz. But I do feel like a lot of the analysis, which focused on the far right, also misses out who was the actual winner of this election. And of course, the Greens lost quite a lot there as well. Before I come on to the CDU, the winners, it's worth noting that the Greens reached a bit of a high point in the last European elections, and they came first, and they mobilized a lot of young supporters. I do think it's likely that this is kind of at least in large part, due to political cycles. Everyone was talking about climate change then. We're not really talking about it as much anymore. So also, it's worth noting that the CDU, in the elections before that, I guess we would be going back to 2015 at this point, there or thereabouts. The youth vote in Germany didn't really differ, actually. So CDU, Chancellor Angela Merkel's party, did very well among the youth, as it did among all age groups of society. Then we saw, over the last couple of elections, the European and federal elections, a bit of a splitting where the youth vote went towards the Greens and the FDP, which is sort of a neoliberal party, Thatcherite, you could call them, but they had quite a good branding for young people. They were pushing the buttons of wannabe entrepreneurs and Bitcoin and digitalization, something that Germany's in dire need of. But yet when they get into power, they didn't do anything. 2019 and 2014, thank you, Julie. So the Greens went from number 1 to I think number 4, and it was quite an embarrassing result for them. I think being in coalition has damaged them. No one really feels very enthusiastic about them. They've had to move very much to the centre, and there's a question of people really aren't sure how much Palestine and Gaza plays a role in this, but I can definitely say anecdotally, I know quite a few people who have a migrant background, is what they say in Germany, people who might not be ethnic German, or who, I have a friend who's mixed Pakistani and Algerian, and there was, during this sort of McCarthy, what some people are calling McCarthyist crackdown on pro-Palestinian solidarity, the Green Vice-Chancellor, Robert Habeck, who's a bit of a liberal darling, said that all Muslims need to distance themselves from Hamas. The SPD's president said something similar. He said about Arabs, so not quite sure. I mean, I would be very surprised to hear that in another country, in the UK at least, where we have, I think, quite a different relationship between religion, state, a bit less Islamophobic, basically. Which might be surprising to hear, but this stuff has quite deep roots in Germany. And so the Greens have been damaged in the coalition. Also, I think climate change isn't quite the topic that it used to be, unfortunately. So they weren't able to mobilize. They couldn't say we're offering change, because what they're actually offering is a kind of quite sclerotic coalition that's done some good investment, but no one's particularly happy about it. A lot of people on the left blame the FDP, the neoliberals, because they have the finance minister, Christian Lindner, who's their party leader. He's basically put himself on collision course with his own coalition. So a lot of ambitious measures have been blocked by the coalition, or there was one case last year of the budget, the special fund for the green transition, obviously something important for green voters, being blocked by the Constitutional Court because of the way they financed it, because Germany has a very strange constitutional measure called the debt brake, which means they actually aren't allowed to borrow. So it's sort of, it's kind of like constitutionally guaranteed austerity when your economy isn't doing very well, and the German economy has not been doing very well for the last couple of years. I can see someone in the chat has posted a report on Islamophobia in Germany, a very important topic, I think, one which I report on a lot and which doesn't get very much attention in the German mainstream media, but I think actually right now the international community is very much increasingly aware of it. So coming on to the CDU, as I said I would, the CDU, or often called Union, because it's actually sort of two parties in one, a bit like Labour and Cooperative, but the CDU is Merkel's party, but they have a Bavarian offshoot called the CSU. So they only stand in Bavaria, where they're practically unchallenged as government. I don't think they've actually ever been out of government there, and they tend to be even more conservative. Just one example, the former interior minister, who was from the CSU, said it was, I think, his 70th birthday, and he said, what do I want for my 70th birthday? I want to deport 70 Afghans back to Afghanistan. Which is a debate that Germany is having again now, after that being stopped by, I think, the Greens. Yeah, so they do have a bit more of a right-wing streak, like quite a strong right-wing streak in Bavaria, particularly in CSU. And the Union is currently led by Friedrich Merz, who it was a long-term rival of Angela Merkel. He has a bit of a cartoonish character to him. He's definitely moved the CDU to the right, away from this sort of Merkelian center, where it didn't do very well in the last election under a Merkel kind of supportive figure, Armin Laschet, the last federal election, of course. So a lot of people have looked at the rise of the far right and have said, we want the CDU to stand for the right-wing values, conservative values, deporting people, immigration, stopping immigration, and that will stop the AfD. Of course, that's not what's happened. The CDU has done very well. They got 30% of the vote, which is pretty high. It's practically double what the AfD got, and they were in second place. So I think you have to remember that the CDU are not in government for the first time in quite a while. So this was actually more of a protest vote. I think if you look at how Germany voted in the European elections, vast majority of votes, I think around 70%, went to parties that were not that are not in the what's called the traffic light government, the Ampel coalition. It's called the traffic light government because it's got red, the Social Democrats, green, the Greens, and yellow, the FDP. So if you hear people talk about traffic light, if I say it again, that's what I'm referring to, Olaf Scholz's coalition. So one thing I have seen recently is an increased focus on immigration among the CDU. One thing that changed, one of the few things actually that brought the traffic light coalition together, I would say, was a recognition that Germany needs immigration, that it's time to modernize the citizenship. For a long time, it was unable. It was illegal to get dual citizenship for migrants unless they were European migrants. So, you know, another Europe is possible. Members may think that's quite racist. And, you know, there were exceptions for if you had German blood, effectively. So German citizenship, this also obviously affects electoral results because it determines who can vote. So one quite stark example, I would say, is Neukölln, which is part of Berlin, which has a very large Arab, also Turkish, but particularly Palestinian community. And if you look at the actual votes, I mean, the constituency of Neukölln, the district, is quite a bit bigger than the central part, which is much more Arab. But you see that it's actually very much dominated by the right wing of the SPD, the CDU, quite Islamophobic members do very well there. And I think a large part of that is about lack of representation and ability to vote. So that's obviously played quite a big role in local politics. There's a phrase, Germany is not Neukölln, or Neukölln is not Germany, to talk about, you know, we need to listen to our local voters, rural voters, rather than people in the city. But it is, I would say, racially tinged quite a lot. So the CDU have been focusing very much on migration as a topic. And it seems to have paid dividends, but it is worth noting that when you ask Germans who they want to be the next chancellor, they do prefer Scholz to Merz. So it's possible, I think we've got a year and a bit left of the coalition, of the traffic light coalition. It's possible that SPD might do a bit better, but to be honest with you, the SPD have been very disappointing for their supporters. I think Scholz is really not a very good leader in the traditional sense. He has been missing in action in a lot of cases, and he's left it to other party leaders like Habeck, who I've mentioned, and Christian Lindner, sort of duke it out in public about the direction of the country. And I think he's sort of trying to be a bit of a Merkel, but without really her political ability or leadership, or kind of, she had a certain charisma, didn't she? Whatever you think of her politics, she had a certain stable aura, which I think Germans miss, to be honest. So perhaps they're hoping that they've had a left-leaning government for a few years, that it's led to the rise of the far right. There's definitely a lot of people who think, well, you know, if we have the CDU in power, then we won't have the far right coming up. Things will be a bit more stable. Okay, maybe they won't spend money, and maybe they'll say some stupid things, but it's definitely on some people's minds right now. I think going on further to the left, one other thing we've seen amid this sort of quite chaotic, choleric coalition, the traffic light coalition, is like a further splintering of the vote, not just of the left-wing vote, but particularly that. And so I wanted to come to BSW and the Left Party, who did very badly, it has to be said. The Left Party, specifically, a party which I'm sure many another Europe is possible members will have heard of, and maybe would previously have had quite fond ideas of, as one of the most successful left parties in Europe. So the Left Party was when I moved to Germany, which is 7 years ago, so not that long ago, the Left Party was actually the official opposition, having done very well in that election, and also because the top two parties, the SPD and the CDU, went into a grand coalition, which is quite common here, and which was, you know, we had a good few grand coalitions before the current one. And if I was a betting man, I would say that the next government in Germany will be a Christian Democrat and SPD coalition. So something that's quite anathema to most other countries of the sort of centre-left and centre-right. Often there's a lot of enmity there. I mean, it's sort of like imagining the Cameronite Tories and the Blairites in a coalition. I mean, maybe you can imagine that, actually, but I don't think it's political reality, even if the ideologies are not that far apart. So
Can we finish? Can you just finish up? Is that okay?
Yes,
Sorry.
sure. So I just wanted to say the Left Party splintered into the BSW, the Bundessarer Wagenknecht, which is the first example of a party named after a person in Germany, named after the former parliamentary leader of the Left Party, Sarah Wagenknecht, who had... She's very popular on talk shows. She's very she's quite a good public speaker, but she always talks about the sort of little man, and particularly popular in the East, but not just there. I would say Sarah Wagenknecht, she was sort of under attack by the left party leadership, and she always felt she could do better on her own. She split off, and now rather than getting 3% like the left party, she got 8%, which is actually a very impressive result from 8% for your first election. So we're seeing not just a move to the AfD, but a move away from the traditional parties that have been in government in Germany. And one of those is the BSW, who are very much against support for Ukraine. They're left-wing economically, but very anti-immigration as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. A lot of personalities, and it sounds like there's a lot of personalities in politics in Germany right now. And Merkel was certainly very much like a headmistress whenever she came to the European Parliament. I want to move straight on to the next speakers. I did have a question, but maybe I'll ask it now so that you can think about it. You didn't talk very much about trade unions and the role of the trade unions, and that would be something that might be quite interesting for us to come back to after the next two speakers. Okay, thanks so much, James. It's really helpful. And now I want to move on to Anna Oppenheim, who is a UK-based Polish activist and campaigner. She's very familiar to our Another Europe audience. She's a former staff member here and a current member of the National Committee. But for this event, we're relying on Anna to provide insights as an activist with Razem in London and also in Poland. So Anna, I'll giving the floor to you now.
Hello, yes, thanks for the introduction. As you mentioned, I am an activist with the Polish left-wing party Razem. I'm not a spokesperson for the party, I'm speaking in personal capacity as an activist. Before I get to the European elections, I wanted to give a bit of context so we're all on the same page regarding Poland's political situation before this month. So as you might have heard, Poland had a very significant general election in October of last year, where we defeated PiS, or Law and Justice, the conservative authoritarian right party that was in power for the last 8 years before that, and that was seen as a close ally to the likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary. It was a huge mobilization. More than 70% of people voted in an Eastern European country with a history of low voter turnout, where something like 40–50% was much more common. It was really a sense of all hands on deck. This is our chance to save Polish democracy, because, as I mentioned, the party was going in a more and more authoritarian direction. What resulted in that huge mobilization was a coalition government. So Law and Justice still was the biggest party, but without a majority to form the government. So instead, we ended up with a coalition of Civic Coalition, which is a party led by Donald Tusk, whose name you probably recognize, sort of center-right liberal party. The Third Way, which is a sort of Christian Democrat center-right party led by a charismatic TV presenter from Hołownia, and then a section of the left. So the left essentially stood on a joint list, including the old Social Democratic Party and my party Razem, representing the more radical left, to the joint list. But after the election, it split in two, with New Left, the old Social Democrats, joining the government with the center right, whereas Razem deciding to stay in opposition. So yeah, where does it take us? And in the meantime, we had local elections. There was a real sense of election fatigue. Most of the campaigns were quite low energy, with activists kind of running out of capacity, running out of funds. So we ended up with a turnout of 40%. Still, decent for Polish size European elections, but obviously significantly lower than the mass mobilization we saw back in the autumn. And in terms of the results, what they reflect, rather than voters really shifting preferences, much as we heard like in France, what they really represent is which parties and which forces manage to mobilize their voters to turn out and vote. So KO, the Civic Coalition, ended up winning this election, becoming the biggest party with 37% of the vote. So quite a solid result. Donald Tusk sees it as a triumph, consolidating his domination on the Polish political scene. But Law and Justice came only 1 percentage point behind that, on 36%. Both junior coalition partners, the Third Way and the Left, underperformed on 6-7% of the vote. Razem and the New Left once again stood as a joint bloc, despite one half of that being in government and the other being in opposition. Obviously a very confusing situation to be in. But who emerged as a third force was Konfederacja, which is a very extreme conspiracy theorist, far-right, pro-Russian party, who also did reasonably well in the general election. Back then it got 7% of the vote, but 12% is the most they ever got. And that's largely by, being the groundwork for years, really, talking about the EU as a threat to our freedoms, spreading conspiracy theories about 15-minute cities, how the EU wants to ban us from leaving our district, or spreading fears about how EU regulations will force people to eat insects, like absolutely ludicrous stuff. But that was their key message. So their voters really, really mobilized to show up and making them the third force in this election. So, and most devastatingly, they performed quite well among young people and women, which previously backed the left quite strongly. Like women in general, you wouldn't expect to be voting for a very misogynistic, anti-abortion, anti-women's rights party. But unfortunately this time, not necessarily that women are changing their preferences, but that these voters did mobilize and vote. So yeah, as I mentioned, Konfederacja, the extreme far right, had a campaign based on fear of EU regulations and a threat to our freedom. KO, the winner, also had a campaign based on fear, but a different kind of fear. Their key message of the kind of center-right liberals was around security. So they talked a lot about Ukraine, but in the sense that a divided Europe, or Poland being in conflict with the European Union, like it was under Law and Justice, would necessarily mean being closer to Russia and strengthening Putin. So that was a very sort of emotionally appealing message. Also, it's worth saying that being European, being part of the EU, waving EU flags is really at the core of KO and Donald Tusk's identity in politics. So you can imagine their support base being very motivated to show up and vote. Security also came up, but in a different way, on the topic of borders. I'll come back to this at the end, but the border crisis on the Belarusian border and EU migration asylum policy in general was a very hot topic in this campaign. And as it went on, KO was moving further and further to the right, talking about hybrid warfare, talking about a civilization threat to Europe, in this rhetoric being slightly less racist in the far right, but really not far off. And yeah, unfortunately, that was the message that people saw in the media day in, day out. In terms of, I don't want to talk about Trzecia Droga because, frankly, their personality-based party is not particularly interesting, but I will talk about the left. So the left ended this election with only 6% of the vote. That is a devastatingly low result. What it struggled to have, I think, is a sort of elevator pitch. It did have good policies. So it talked, for example, about a European fund for social housing. It talked about leveling up workers' rights. It talked positively about environmental regulations. But I feel like it was framed in quite a technical, nerdy language without much emotional appeal, despite being the most pro-European force in Poland. It didn't really speak to that pro-Europeanism that is still very widespread in Poland. The other obvious challenge it had was a lack of coherence, because, well, how do you have a clear message about the place of Poland in Europe and where Poland is at if one part of your political force is in government and the second one is in the opposition? And that's really something that came across, that the two parts of the left were internally conflicted, There was no massive discipline. There was a lot of confusion. And this came up again on the topic of migration, because as I mentioned, the border crisis with Belarus, where for about 2 years now, Lukashenko has been encouraging migrants from the Middle East, from Asia, from Africa, to come to Europe via Poland, promising them they'll get status. That's obviously not what happened. Instead, there have been very broad pushbacks, border guards, the army, literally throwing people over the fence, including pregnant women, children, and people dying in the forest, not being able to come to Poland and claim their status. A really, really horrific situation. And while most of the parties in, more or less explicit terms, or actually quite explicit terms, endorse the pushbacks policy, the left is opposed to it, but really struggled to communicate that, and especially the more center left. And there was a situation just a few days before the election where a Polish soldier was stabbed by a radicalized migrant at the border and ended up dying. And then the leadership of the left, unilaterally, without consulting with Razem, without consulting the candidates, decided to suspend their entire campaign, which a lot of candidates didn't follow. Some Razem candidates continued to post on social media, continued campaigning, because why is left meant to be the only party that suspends an election campaign after the death of a soldier? Where, a lot of candidates did have a strong message about how a safe border is a border in which no one dies, and that applies to soldiers, sure, but it applies to refugees as well. In terms of other topics, like a bit like, you've seen farmers protest across Europe against the European Green Deal. There's also been a kind of anti-environmental move in Poland, which is also reflected by the liberals, by the far right, where the left did have a strong message, but once again, fail, I think, to show how it have an actively positive impact on people's lives, other than just, talking about how we have this responsibility as a civilization, as a generation, but struggle to really communicate how, really improving the lives of working class people and protecting the planet are two sides of the same coin.
Can I ask you to finish up, Hannah?
Yeah. So basically, to summarize where Poland is at, is we have an entrenchment of central left liberalism. Tusk definitely is seen as the leader, probably the next president of Poland, and the leading force. But the radical right and the far right threat is very much still there. And the left now is facing big questions, regrouping, will probably properly split in two, but that is yet to be seen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. It's a very worrying picture, and we've been holding our breath for a long time watching developments in Poland. I really appreciate your insight. We're going to move to Andrea Pissarro, who is also on the National Committee of Another Europe is Possible. Andrea is an academic. He's a very prominent organizer and campaigner within the Italian diaspora in the UK. He founded Europe for Scotland, which is working with some other Another Europe is Possible members, because Scotland voted to stay in the EU and is very angry that they're out. Anyway, Andrea, if you could give us your view on from a kind of Italian sort of Anglo perspective about what happened at the EU elections and what might change.
Sure, thank you, Julie. As a disclaimer, I will start by saying that on top of everything else you said, I'm also a member of the Italian Democratic Party, so in my presentation I might be a little biased, but my short report from Italy is gonna try to be a bit more optimistic than the reports that you heard so far from different European countries, because I think the results of the European elections in Italy were not that bad. I will make three main points that in part replicate across Europe, but in part do not. The first is that, as we heard from a few of the earlier analysis, the predicted rise of the far right was not as strong as predicted, in fact. And Italy is a case in point, because despite the fact that Meloni, the prime minister, had the strongest result with 28%, the far right in Italy overall decreased its share of votes compared to the 2019 election. This is because the far right in Italy split between Salvini and Meloni, and whilst Meloni went up, Salvini went dramatically down. And as an Italian, every day I'm sad because Meloni is where she is, but there is a part of me that rejoices in seeing Salvini sinking lower and lower. And this is a more general point. I think in many other European countries, the far right struggled a bit more than expected. One other lesson that comes from Italy is, though, my second point, that this was the first European election since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you look at the results overall, probably they don't look that good for Putin. Italy, again, is a case in point, because the main difference, if you want, between the far right of Meloni and the far right of Salvini was the position on Ukraine, with Meloni supporting Ukraine and Salvini so much was supporting Russia that at some point he was even trying to get money from Russia, and the Russians didn't give it to him because probably didn't believe he was a great politician. But just to make the point that there was a division in the right, there is, unfortunately, from my perspective, also a division in the left, and the results were good for those parties and movements that were offering more solidarity to Ukraine. So I'm just gonna share my, I don't have a slide, unfortunately, but I just want to show a snapshot of the Italian results so that you can see. Is it working? Can you see all these symbols? So this allows me to show you one thing, that party with an attachment to a persona in Italy is ubiquitous. So you have Meloni with a big Meloni on the symbol. You have Salvini with a big Salvini on the symbol. We even still have Berlusconi on the symbol, despite him being dead by a year, but nostalgia runs deep in Italy. And the point I wanted to make about Ukraine was that the Democratic Party has risen to 24%, whereas the Five Star Movement has decreased its share of votes to 10%, which is a huge drop from the previous European election. And I think this, again, resonates with some of the things we've seen in Europe with Orban and Fico struggling, and if you want, perhaps also the fact that the socialist revival in France was perhaps driven by support for Ukraine. The third and last point I want to make about the Italian election is that overall, the Italian opposition is not only stronger than expected, but is also looking in a very good shape to go very well in the next general election. This is very good news, not least because Elly Schlein, the leader of the Democratic Party, is very likely to lead the Progressive Coalition, and she's a very good friend of Another Europe is Possible. She was with us a few years ago, Julie, we remember that, and we very much hope that she can turn the situation around in Italy, because obviously it's very serious with Meloni, that is still a post-fascist leader, and we need to make sure that we get rid of her as soon as we can. So just to say how complicated the situation still is, that the left is divided again. The Partito Democratico and the Five Star Movement are two elements of this progressive alliance that we need to build. But another party that did very well in this European election is the Alleanza Verdi and Sinistra, which is a left red-green coalition that includes Greens and people elected in the left, that got 6.73%, and this was a huge rise from the previous results, not least because they had the wisdom to have as a candidate Ilaria Salis, who is a young Italian teacher which was in a Hungarian prison because she was arrested during an anti-fascist demonstration in Budapest a few years ago. And putting her as a candidate, she could be elected and gaining European immunity. She was freed just a few days ago from the Hungarian prisons. So this is also a reason to rejoice, in my view. The results of the Italian left was driven partly by the fact that there was a strong push for a social agenda. So breaking with the neoliberal tradition of the left in previous years, Elly Schlein in particular put forward an agenda talking about minimum wage, minimum income, defending the health system, reducing waiting lists, and expressing support both for Palestine and Ukraine. I think these were strong assets that drove up the result. Point that we talked about previously, there was a collapse of the liberal center. You can see these parties here. This is Stati Uniti d'Europa, was the list of Matteo Renzi, former prime minister. Very poor result. And likewise, the list of Calenda, minister of Renzi, they were split and neither of them passed the threshold to elect MEPs in parliament. And again, I think the liberal collapse is a narrative across Europe, particularly Mediterranean country like in France, we have seen with Macron, same in Italy with Renzi. Likewise in Greece, where I think there is no centrist and no elected for the centrist group. I think I can also mention that there was a list that was very opposed to Ukraine that got really poor result here. It was also the list of DN25 that failed to elect anyone in Italy, but also in Greece. And I want to mention this because in European elections, we need also to look at the results of pan-European movement. So DN failed to elect anyone, Varoufakis was not elected, whereas Volt, which is more liberal centrist party, elected 5 MEPs. And I wish there would be one day a pan-European left-wing party capable of electing many MEPs. Just a very quick point about what happens next, because now there is the election of the new European Commission. And of course, the results that we have seen with a strong representation for the right-wing People's Party suggest that von der Leyen is a very obvious candidate to replace herself. A big point of contention will be whether Meloni will support her in the European parliamentary vote. There is a lot of discussions. The socialists and all of us probably would really like Meloni to stay out of power in Europe as much as possible. But von der Leyen seems to be inclined to get her support, so much so that Politico was reporting today that she delayed the publication of a report critical of Italy on media freedom, because one thing that I want to conclude on is that Meloni is really bad for free media in Italy. She personally sued some journalists. They are trying to prevent the publication of critical reports. They even banned a speech from Antonio Scurati, who is an Italian writer, who was planning to intervene on Rai to talk about Matteotti, this Italian socialist who killed 100 years ago by Mussolini. Even 100 years later, these things are controversial for the fascists in government. And so it's really important that the next European Parliament keeps Meloni as much as possible out of the circles that matter. Very, very briefly, Europe for Scotland tried to make European candidates express solidarity for Scotland, and indeed there were candidates from France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Belgium and Ireland expressing these voices. Very weak voices from the Greens and the Lib Dems in Europe, consistent with the general weakness, electorally speaking. And I was speaking with Brando Benifei, who is an elected MEP from Italy, from the Democratic Party, who also expressed solidarity to Scotland, that was talking about the fact that the European Union needs to get fit for enlargement, which is a serious reform now the EU operates, which is of course an opportunity for Scotland, but let me add also for England and Wales and for Britain as a whole to rejoin the European Union at a moment in which the European Union is trying to reform to allow Ukraine, but also countries in the West to rejoin. So with this note of hope, I give back the word to the floor.
Thank you very much, Andrea. You know, I used to work in theatre, and whenever I hear about Italian politics, it just feels like a Dario Fo play to me. Yeah, but very good to see Elly Schlein leading, you know, showing incredible leadership, and such a good person. And I hope that she will one day be the Prime Minister of Italy. Would be amazing. We've got a little bit of time left for questions. I wonder if there are any questions that other people want to ask. I did have a question for James about the role of the trade unions in Germany, but equally that question could go to both you, Andrea, and Anna also, because trade unions haven't been discussed very much. We did talk a little bit about it with Alice, but we haven't subsequently interrogated what the trade unions are doing in these different countries. So James, if you're still on the line, it'd be really good to just hear something about the role of the trade unions currently.
Yeah, I think I didn't say much because there's not really that much to say. I haven't seen very much at all from the trade unions, but I would like to make a bit of a wider point, which I think Germany has quite a strong tendency towards like an elite consensus. So they would call it Mitbestimmung, where everyone gets to have a voice. But what that means is there's quite a strong kind of representative tradition, quite hierarchical throughout German civil society and politics. And that means that there are a lot of people who don't get a say because they're not willing to work through party and union bureaucracies. There's also some topics which are very much anathema. I'm thinking of any kind of engagement for Palestine would render you absolutely unable to enter any structures in Germany at all, whether they're artistic, political, or union-based. So unions, I would say, are part of the problem, actually, because people are not being, although they do some good work in fighting for their members, there are some good ones. I have my own personal experiences where my union has been taken over by, my union branch as a journalist has been taken over by a very extreme pro-Israel figure who sides with the police when they attack Palestinian journalists and Palestinian supporting and just honest journalists. So nothing positive to say about the German trade unions, even though they do have, some quite strong historical achievements.
Yeah, thank you for that. I partly wanted to ask the question because when I was an MEP, I was involved in the trade union cross-party intergroup. And in fact, the German CDU members were very, very active in that intergroup, which I always found quite strange. Like it wasn't a natural kind of place for their, for that political family. So yeah, I'm very aware of, if you like, that kind of rather sort of centre-right kind of trade unionism that exists. Definitely. And Andrea and Anna, do you have a kind of perspective on trade union activism and mobilization and from your respective countries?
Yeah, very, very quickly, I very much welcome this question because the Italian trade union has very recently launched a campaign to collect signatures to abolish a law that was passed by the Renzi's government on jobs. It was called the Jobs Act. It was a reform that was making it easier to fire workers. The trade union are mobilizing against that reform, and a lot of people in the left are supporting this effort, including Elly Schlein, who controversially for some people in her party, because her party used to be the party of Renzi. Italian politics is very complicated in how politicians switch from party to party. But now the leader of the Democratic Party is Elly Schlein. She signed this signature collection for this new referendum, and we hope to abolish this law that made it more easier to fire workers.
Yeah, and
go on, Anna.
in terms of Poland, I mean, the trade union movement in Poland is unfortunately very weak. Trade unions were largely destroyed in the 90s during the neoliberal reforms. And it's not seen at the political forums in the same way it is in the UK, although obviously it's declined here as well. Some unions, such as what's left of Solidarność, very much a shadow of its former self, is actually quite conservative and seen as close to law and justice. There are other unions that are more progressive, and Razem has been putting a lot of effort into trying to build those links, sending activists and MPs to picket lines, supporting strikes, talking about trade union rights. But I think there is still a very, very, very long way to go until there's significant movement.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, and we're certainly seeing here in the UK much greater activity in the trade unions who've been fighting a whole raft of. I mean, we've had doctors out on strike, which is kind of unprecedented. So it feels like that people woke up a bit in the UK when they realised that so many of their their employment rights were going to be taken away from them. We have a little bit of time left if anybody has any other questions. I don't know if there's any in the chat. Apparently I can extend back.
Michael and Mike both have questions with their hands up.
Oh, did they? Sorry, I'm not looking at hands up. I was looking at the chat. Okay, so Mike, let's. Oh yeah, because they put their hands up. Okay, Michael Chesham, you look like you're skiing. Okay.
Don't even think that.
Sorry.
Answers in uproar. There were various allusions to the different parties' attitudes to Ukraine and Russia. And I was speculating as to whether there were any links that the Soviets, I'm going to say, as in the Putin state today, had maintained with individuals and possibly party organizations within various countries to enable support for Russia in the Ukraine conflict to be sustained, or is it pretty much, in Germany's case, a hangover from the Second World War and attitudes to that, and Poland, obviously, a very, very sensitive subject in all kinds of ways. But it was just that there seems to be for some parties, such a strong alignment with Putin, which seems very curious, and certainly for most Western Europeans, I'd have thought.
Thanks for the question. Who wants to take that question first? And then Michael will ask a question.
Perhaps I can take it very briefly to say that in Italy there is two streams of support for Putin. One is economic, from a sector of the economy that was depending on Russian export, mostly is right wing in both. There is also, unfortunately, from my perspective, a bit of nostalgia for the Soviet Union that, especially among older voters, drive a certain anti-NATO, anti-American perspective that therefore brings about some shyness in supporting Ukraine.
Anna?
Poland is largely united in terms of military aid for Ukraine specifically. We had both of the main parties, so Civic Coalition and Law and Justice, accusing each other of being pro-Russian, and then both like very fiercely denying it. I don't think there's a massive difference in policy there. The left in Poland is actually very, very enthusiastically pro-Ukrainian, and Razem has been doing a lot of work with other left parties in Europe to try to get them to the right position on this, which is great. The only exception is Konfederacja, so the extreme far right, who are more pro-Russian. They try to tone it down because it's very unpopular in Poland and it has backfired previously. Like, yeah, they're the only party that's against continuing military aid. Other than that, there's pretty much a consensus on this.
Yeah, Razem certainly showing the way, I think, Anna, for left parties in their support for Ukraine. James, do you want to answer that question?
I have to agree with you there. As you may pick up from my t-shirt, I'm quite a big supporter of Ukraine. I think the Central Eastern European left has a much better grasp of this than in some other places. Germany being a bit of an exception to that, to segue into my answer, what you do see is the centre parties in government are in favor. They are pro-Ukraine. They do give quite a lot of money, and it has to be said, quite a lot of weapons. Ukraine, Germany's been a bit sluggish with giving some of them, very much following the US's lead, as they often do in foreign policy. Something that I think people don't quite understand from the outside. But the anti-establishment parties, the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht's party, very much on the skeptical side, pro-Putin. I mean, Germany for a long time bought gas from Russia and made Europe more dependent on Putin's Russia. And a lot of Germans say, well, we want to get rid of, wasn't it better back then? You know, our industry was better. And you know, the war has been pretty damaging to Germany's industry, it has to be said. But of course, the responsibility for that, I think, lies in making your economy dependent on a quasi-fascist imperialist state. So a lot of East Germans, there's this thing called an Ostalgie. It's one of those nice German words where it's a nostalgia for the East. I have reported from East Germany quite a lot. And, you know, a lot of people say, oh, wasn't it better during the Soviet Union? We were all brothers and stuff like that. But I don't think they actually, I'd say it's quite a shallow sentiment because, you know, they did rise up against that and want to join the West. And, you know, for all of the questions about how fair the reunification was, I don't think there's actually many people who view the Russians as the big brothers and that sort of thing, but they are just generally very anti-West, anti the establishment, and they see the Ukraine, money going to Ukraine when allegedly there isn't much money for kindergartens in the East, although I do believe that actually East Germany is better supported than in large parts of West Germany, and is actually a very nice place. So sometimes I think they're being a bit silly with the complaining, although there are bad jobs. The economy is not great and the job opportunities aren't great. So.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Michael, you still have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I had two points in a question. If I'll do them very briefly. Or is it just questions, or can I just introduce them?
I think you can. I think yeah, we've got 5 minutes, so yeah, you can have some time.
I'll give it a go. One reflection on D-Day, on memory, is striking me a lot at the moment about the European far right and how the far right has managed to escape memory of fascism. Like when you see Marine Le Pen's output around D-Day, that really struck me around Marine Le Pen and her what she was putting out on social media around D-Day. It was like we honor the fallen heroes who died for our freedom, or Meloni attending National Liberation Day on the 25th of April and laying a wreath when, like, you know, like the Brothers of Italy literally has the same logo as Italian social movement, as the post Mussolini organization. It's fascinating how kind of the passing of time is strengthening these people and making them a lot less taboo. I wonder if that's something that's worth reflecting on. The second thing I was going to say is, in a way, I think there's a reason to be optimistic in amongst all of this grimness, which is it's a question really, like, has the far right hit some kind of voter ceiling? They've had their surge. It's, you know, like the post crash world was really, really bad. The center collapsed. And the far right made hay. Are they, you know, they basically established themselves as the biggest or second biggest parties in lots of countries in Europe now, in some like the third biggest. It's really, really bad, but has it hit a ceiling or has it not? And I think the thing that, even if you think it has hit a ceiling, I think the problem is for the kind of majority anti-fascist bloc in society, and there's a question as to how much that exists, is just as the far right seems to be plateauing or you know, remaining at a horribly high level but not continuing to spike, the center right seems to be countenancing alliances with them. So I mean, like, it used to be that, you know, like, Germany was supposed to have been inoculated against this stuff, right? And okay, loads of people in the East are really fed up with the establishment and have imbibed lots of racist narratives. They're going to vote for the far right, but actually there's a cap on how much influence they can have ultimately and how much the AfD can really break through, unless the Christian Democrats suddenly turn around. As one of my questions would be to everyone, as well as Jay specifically on Germany, to what extent is the centre right, and even in some cases the centre, softening towards removing the cordon sanitaire around these people? You know, to what extent are they going to let them in? Oh, and a cheeky second question to Jay: is the German left also? What's Wagenknecht saying about Ukraine? Because I think it's not good. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you pick up on that. Thank you.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
So I just want to say, I think we are also ignoring Austria a little bit in this, to pick up on your first statement, because Austria, just for the first time, actually, the far right have come in first place, the FPÖ Freedom Party, which was founded by SS veterans have come first place in Austria, and there is also national elections in Austria, and it's entirely likely that the FPÖ will be in first place there. In Germany, they don't have the same cordon sanitaire or firewall against far right that they do in Germany. The FPÖ have been in government a number of times with the centre-right, but never as the chancellor. And I think it's possible that we will see a far-right chancellor in Austria. You know, I think that is quite worrying. But in Germany, and this does bring in Sarah Wagenknecht, it's possible that the far right will do. There are 3 state elections coming up, and just great luck that we have. They happen to be in the states where the far right are the most extreme and the most popular. So particularly in the state of Thuringia, there's a very, very scary leader called Björn Höcke, who has been, you can legally call him a fascist in Germany. You can't call anyone else a fascist, or they can sue you, but a court has ruled you can legally call him a fascist. He apes Hitler's speeches and his phraseology, and he's very popular for it, actually. So, and he could quite possibly end up winning enough votes to have an absolute majority in Thuringia, which is in the east, and if it's not enough for majority, it might actually be that the Sarah Wagenknecht's party could go into alliance with the AfD and bring them to power without any of the old parties or the established parties giving them any, without them having any support. I think we are seeing increasing cooperation on very low levels between the CDU, but it's still a very explosive issue. But actually, I think the last CDU leader, the one who's Merkel's successor, she couldn't keep her Eastern parties under control, and she had to resign for that. We're going to see Merz's leadership tested there, because I really think if the option in Thuringia in particular is a left-led government or a deal with the left or the far-right AfD, because the left also do very well in Thuringia, we could see the CDU going for the far-right. And then also play for, right? It'll be a huge scandal. Let's see what happens then. Okay, thank you.
I think we're running out of time now. I don't know where my tech team are, so don't know if we can just have some brief comments from Andrea and Anna, and then we'll finish. Okay, yeah. So Anna,
yeah. So I wouldn't say modern Polish democracy ever had that kind of cordon sanitaire. Law and Justice was the biggest party for many years, and it was very comfortable working side by side with fascist street movements. And the idea of there being a divide between the center right and the far right was just not really there. I think for now, I'm relieved that Law and Justice has lost that position of the biggest party. They've lost a lot of their support. There is a sense that they've gone too far on many things, from democracy to abortion rights to LGBT rights. At the same time, well, there's also the insurgent far right with Confederacja, who are seen as kind of trendier, cooler, speaking to more young men in particular. Now liberals seem like the winning force, but my worry is if people's living standards don't improve under this government, or in fact get worse, there will be space for the far right to come back.
Very briefly from Italy, the cordon sanitaire was destroyed 30 years ago by Berlusconi, that invited the fascists to join government. And in many ways, you can argue that Berlusconi was even more authoritarian than Meloni. In fact, this party was not democratic at all. That's why there is still the name of Berlusconi in the symbol of the party right now, that is dead. Meloni has been trying to become a bit more moderate and present herself better. But of course, if you go into any headquarters of her party in Italy, you'll find people doing the fascist salute and saying, chanting for Mussolini. So there is a lot of work to be done, even in terms of telling the history of the country that many people have forgotten. There is no time to discuss it now, though. So let's keep up our anti-fascist struggle. Let's keep the memory alive, and let's make a better Europe founded on anti-fascism.
Thank you. That's a fantastic. Yeah, that's a fantastic thought and hope to and call to action, actually, which is a great way to end this this discussion. Of course, we have our own problems here in the UK. We're having an election on July 4th, and Nigel Farage's newest iteration, a company, not a political party, called Reform, looks like it might overtake, or has already overtaken, the Tory party, might get 7 MPs. This is unbelievable. I mean, having watched him, watched his antics at close quarters in the European Parliament, you know, the last thing that we want is that idiot. And well, idiot, he's not idiot, he's a very clever man, but to have him in government, sorry, to have him in the Parliament here in the UK, calling himself already the opposition, is a new turn, really, for British politics. So we'll return to that. Okay, right. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us for 15 minutes longer. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to all the people behind the scenes. Thanks to all my comrades in Another Europe is Possible. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.